I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about Lab. So we're an independent publishers, and we've published more than 150 books on Latin America since we were founded in the late 1970s. We're also a registered charity, and we keep up a lively news website at lab.org.uk. And Lab's early work tended to focus on denouncing and reporting on human rights violations, often working with Latin American refugees and exiles. But over the years, the organization expanded, publishing books on indigenous peoples, popular culture, women, the environment, and we've even translated and published a couple of novels. So some of our most successful titles, I think you can see them here on the right, are Faces of Latin America by Duncan Green, Under the Eagle by Jenny Pierce, the very popular In Focus series, which in recent years has been repackaged as Inside Out, and more recently, Rosa of the Wildgrass by Fiona McIntosh. So today, Lab continues to expand, looking for new projects and new opportunities for collaboration. So some of our upcoming books include a new addition to the Inside Out series, Mexico Inside Out, which is written by Nick Caister and is due out in April. Bolivia Crossed Up Off the Map, which is a slightly new format for Lab. It's a piece of narrative travel writing by the travel writer and journalist Shafik Meji, and that's due out in the autumn. And then, as Paula mentioned, next year, we hope to publish The Heart of Our Earth, Community Resistance to Mining in Latin America. Also, over the last year, Lab has developed a new strand to its work called Research Engagement and Impact, which involves developing partnerships with researchers in universities, looking for ways to help them showcase their work and engage with the public beyond the campus. So last year we did a project called Indigenous Brazil Violated, and you can see here a screenshot of the website we produced. And this was a project with a researcher at the University of Cardiff, plus researchers in 3 Brazilian universities. And it looked at the recent intensification of violence in Brazil towards indigenous people, how this is covered in the media, and how indigenous people themselves have responded to it. We've also got a project on the go at the moment called Women Resisting Gendered and Intersectional Violence, which is a partnership with King's College. And this will explore and celebrate grassroots campaigns and organizations that combat violence towards women and girls across Latin America. But today I want to talk to you a bit about our book, Voices of Latin America, which was published in 2019. So in 2015, 2016 or so at Lab, we decided we needed to produce a replacement for Duncan Green's Faces of Latin America, which is a great book and it's been very successful, but as it was originally published in 1991, it was very out of date. So during discussions on this, we decided that over the years, Lab's unique contribution has been to bring the voices of Latin Americans fighting for human rights and social justice to the English-speaking world. And so this is how Voices was born. We set ourselves the challenge of documenting and reporting on some of the region's most important and dynamic social movements in a book and also on a website. And the finished book, it features interviews with around 70 people from 14 different countries, from Mexico to the Southern Cone. The interviews were mostly done from 2016 to 18, and the book came out in January 2019. So just some of our voices included. So Chilean student protesters such as Valeria Abad, who was heavily involved with the Chilean Federation of Students, CONFECH, and in general with the student movement there. As well, we covered indigenous Ecuadorians such as Heriberto Gualinga, resisting oil drilling on their territory. So Heriberto is a Sarayaku Quechua filmmaker and director of the film Children of the Jaguar. We also spoke to Ribeirinhos, so riverine people in Pará, Brazil, who were impacted by the massive Belo Monte hydroelectric dam. And this is Leonardo Batista, also known as Aronor. And finally, mothers in Mexico looking for their children who had gone missing. So this is Ana Enamorado, a Honduran woman who works with an organization called the Movimiento Migrante Mesoamericano. And here you can see she's holding a picture of her son, Oscar, who went missing in Mexico. So Voices is really a rich panorama of activists, community leaders, artists, journalists, academics, and many others. So people in general trying to make a difference and fighting for positive change in their communities and in their countries. And I think it included both the voices of people articulating what we might call more middle class concerns that went beyond basic poverty relief. So things like improvements in healthcare, improved education, particularly access to higher education, public transport, improved pensions, and so on. But these voices were also raised alongside, although in some ways separate from, those more violently excluded by the economic model. So for example, those in rural areas impacted by extractivism, popular struggles in the cities. So for example, homeless movements, the unemployed, and neighborhood associations in poor communities and informal communities such as favelas. I think in all cases, this flourishing of social movements that we've seen was only ever necessary because the transition to democracy in Latin America was so flawed and historical injustices are still very present, and in some cases are worse than in the past. We've also seen new forms and patterns of exploitation that have emerged. So for example, the expansion of extractive industries into areas where they had no presence before, and also the expansion of organized crime and the emergence of new criminal groups. So what has changed since publication? In 2019 alone, there was large-scale political unrest in Venezuela, Bolivia, Chile, Honduras, Colombia, Ecuador, Haiti, and Nicaragua. And this comes after an extended period of economic stagnation or decline for much of the region. Analysts are already calling the 2010s a second lost decade in reference to the debt crisis of the 1980s. Many former gains of Latin America's so-called new middle class have been wiped out, and they were in a precarious position even before the pandemic. Needless to say, COVID-19 has been a disaster. The response has been dreadful, especially from what we might hope would be the leading nations, such as Mexico and Brazil. And here you've got the little cartoon of Bolsonaro standing on a pile of bones and saying, "Y daí, so what?" which is a direct quotation. Globally, Latin America and the Caribbean have 18.6% of COVID cases and 27% of deaths, despite accounting for just 8.4% of the global population. These figures are also likely to be big underestimates, given the lack of proper testing regimes and the fact that some governments, in particular Mexico and Venezuela, appear to be deliberately undercounting. So the recovery is likely to be more protracted than elsewhere, and the economic consequences severe. Tens of millions are likely to fall into poverty in the coming years. So given that these last couple of years have been so tumultuous, with Voices, we always intended for this to be an ongoing project. So to keep the website going long after the publication of the book. But the last 2 years have really reinforced this for us. And so we're working on new chapters for Voices, including on the COVID-19 pandemic and the community response to it. I recently did an interview with an activist in the favela Jacari in Rio in Brazil about the local response to the pandemic there. Some of these new interviews that we're doing for Voices, we will show in a webinar series, which is upcoming. So topics include women and LGBT rights, students and state violence, indigenous peoples, the environment and mining, and cultural resistance. So these webinars will be once a month from mid-March. So please do keep an eye on the lab website and on our social media for more details. So I stop sharing for a moment. So many of the activists we interviewed for Voices were resisting extractive projects of one kind or another. The title of this keynote is Latin America at Breaking Point. So this is a quotation from an interview I did for Voices back in 2018 with the Argentine sociologist Maristela Svampa. What she meant by this was that the end of the commodities boom in Latin America meant the exacerbation of the extractive model to make up for the trade deficit. She said that Latin America was entering a new cycle of human rights violations. It's nearly 2 years since I did that interview, and I think her thesis looks accurate. Latin America remains the world's most dangerous region for environmental and human rights activists, and the situation is getting worse. A recent report came out published by Frontline Defenders. It found 331 killings of these activists globally in 2020. More than 3/4 of them were in Latin America, and more than half the total in Colombia alone. And it's the activists working on indigenous land and environmental rights who are the most likely to be targeted. In other words, the kind of people who are going to be resisting extractivism. And this is especially clear if you look at Colombia, where most of the violence is happening in mining and oil regions. So in Voices, Maristela Svampa draws a correlation between extractivism on the one hand and weak democracy and human rights abuses on the other. And I think in the context of COVID, this has been reinforced. Governments and companies have used the pandemic to ramp up extractive activities, declaring them essential and allowing them to operate even during national lockdowns. They've shut down or bypassed the opposition and intensified persecution of activists. And they've also changed laws and regulations in order to favor extractive projects. So just a couple of examples of that. In Peru, the government passed a law last year facilitating the use of lethal force by the police and the military. This was criticized by Human Rights Watch and the UN. And I think it's particularly concerning in Peru, given that this is a country where the police are legally allowed to work as the security detail on mining projects. And in Peru now, the violence against environmental and human rights activists is at its worst level since 2014. Recently, I spoke to Marcos Brito, who is a young indigenous Wayu activist at the Resguardo Provincial indigenous reservation located very close to the Cerrejón coal mine in La Guajira, Colombia. So Cerrejón is Latin America's largest open pit coal mine and one of the largest of its kind in the world. And it has a very long, dark history of displacement, pollution, and conflicts with local communities. In fact, for Voices, we interviewed Rogelio Ustate, an Afro-Colombian poet and activist who was part of the tobacco community, which was violently removed by the Colombian police in 2001 in order to make way for expansion of the mine. So Marcos told me that last year, Cerrejón stopped operating due to the pandemic and also due to a strike by mine workers. But now, not only is it active again, it's ramping up production in order to make up for lost time. And this is despite rulings from the Colombian Constitutional Court, ordering the mine to mitigate the impacts on nearby communities, and even an intervention from the UN, which called on Cerrejón to suspend its operations during the pandemic precisely because it was making local communities more vulnerable to death and serious illness from COVID-19. So extractive projects rely on authoritarian tactics, or at least the threat of them, to prosper. Whenever they are subject to proper democratic scrutiny, either by state institutions or by the communities which stand to be affected, they often slow down or even halt altogether. And in 2018, Lab spoke to Cesar Padilla of the Latin American Observatory of Mining Conflicts. And he told us, "I know of very few communities that want mining. And of those which have had some mining, I know very few which still want it." A statement which I think could be applied to extractive projects in general. So just let me share my screen again. So in Argentina, in Chubut, last year, local assemblies presented what's called a second popular initiative. So this is using a direct democracy mechanism where citizens can present proposals for law. And this had 30,000 signatures attached to it. And the aim was to tighten up a 2003 law which prohibited open pit mining and the use of cyanide in the province. However, the governor of Chubut is pro-mining, and he aimed to block this initiative with what's called a zoning proposal. In other words, allowing mining in the meseta, the central area of the province, but not in the mountains. And this would effectively pave the way for Pan American Silver's Navidad project, which would be one of the largest silver mines in the world. And I think this is a good example of how governments have used the pandemic to sidestep resistance. So this government proposal was presented over Zoom in a 3-hour Zoom session with 27 legislators, and the communities that stood to be affected by this were not consulted, and that includes Mapuche indigenous communities. However, there have been massive mobilizations across Chubut in response, despite all the hardships and difficulties that the pandemic imposes. And so I'd like to show you now a very short video of a march in Esquel in December. So Esquel is a town of just 30,000 people or so. So you can see from the aerial images the number of people in the streets and the strength of the movement. So in Chubut, the original anti-mining law that they passed in 2003 emerged from a kind of local referendum in Esquel called a consulta popular. And this is a mechanism that's been used effectively in Peru, Guatemala, Colombia, El Salvador, and also Ecuador in 2011, and also recently in this month. In Cuenca. So over 80% of 400,000 voters in Cuenca chose to ban mining in the watershed of the area's 5 rivers. And this will likely affect 2 major projects, Loma Larga, which is the flagship project of the Canadian company INV Metals, as well as the Chinese-owned Rio Blanco project, which was already suspended due to community opposition in 2018. So INV Metals are saying that they will ignore the results of the referendum and the project will go ahead anyway. But I think in light of what's happened, it won't be easy for them. Ecuador is an interesting case because in recent years, it's been pushing mining heavily as an alternative to oil. But there's a growing popular discontent with this model. And I think this is shown also in the unexpectedly strong showing in the presidential elections by the indigenous environmentalist Yacu Perez. So these are both Argentina, Chubut, and Cuenca in Ecuador are both good examples that show how well-organized community resistance to extraction can and does work. So I'd like to make a few final comments. With the ongoing expansion of the extractive model, as well as the fallout from the pandemic, democracy in Latin America is looking very shaky. The next few years will be a bumpy ride. And of the countries I mentioned earlier that have experienced major social and political unrest in 2019, the one country that has managed to respond constructively to citizens' demands is Chile, with citizens now having the chance to write a new constitution via a convention elected by popular vote. And of course, this was no great act of generosity on the part of the Chilean government. This was the product of a genuine social uprising that had widespread popular support. Chile now has the chance to correct its flawed process of democratic transition, a real chance to change the rules of the game. And the reason I've chosen to finish by talking about Chile is because I feel in some ways it's symbolic of the extractive model in Latin America. The way it's been implemented in Chile has been extremely intense. And so when it comes to writing the new constitution, the stakes are extremely high. Chile is experiencing an acute ecological and hydrological crisis. More than 1 million people in Chile don't have enough water to drink, don't have regular access to drinking water, which is a consequence partly of the privatization and commodification of water, which was established by the Pinochet dictatorship, but also overexploitation of natural resources by extractive industries, particularly mining. So, is Latin America at breaking point? Yes. I think the situation now is even more serious than when we were doing the work for Voices of Latin America. And of course, COVID is likely to make matters much worse. However, as the recent examples show, I think social movements can be effective and powerful even in the toughest circumstances, and even during a global pandemic. So with the potential for further deterioration of democracy, they are more urgent now than ever. And however Latin America moves beyond this historical moment, social movements will be key. Thank you very much.